It's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Shashi Tharoor, who in his current avatar is clueless about Indian foreign policy, but he does serve as the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee equivalent for the Indian Parliament. He has been junior minister in the previous in the administration before the last one, and he was the education minister as well. And of course, he has written plenty of research articles and books on foreign policy. Pax Indica, he claims, still is the most authoritative blueprint for Indian foreign policy, which has not been implemented. And this is what he told me I have to plug before the evening commences in return for his coming here. So I had to say this. Now, having said that, he also is someone who is greatly followed on Twitter. He has a big social media fan base. Before Mr. Modi discovered this medium, he was, I think, by far India's most prolific Twitterati. I think
Modi overtook me in July of 2013, so this is really old.
I mean, he overtook your entire party in July of 2013, but that's a different story. But today we are going to be discussing Indian foreign policy with him and not the domestic politics. But Shashi, thank you for joining us. And let me briefly introduce what we are doing here. This is something that Paul created 10 years ago. I think we are on the 10th year now. This is the 10th year of India-US Track 2. We have been partners for the last 7 years. So this is the 7th edition. ORF has been working with them. I think we together have been able to achieve a few things. Besides creating a community who believe in the relationship, I think we have seen a significant transformation, sometimes catalyzed by this forum in terms of the relationship between the navies. For example, the Naval Postgraduate School, the Naval War College in Goa have been now in a relationship for the last 2 or 3 years, courtesy us hand-holding them initially. They have joined us in the Raisina Dialogue. They do simulation exercises for the young fellows that you lead as a dean. They have also this year going to be doing a simulation exercise for our German partners. So in a sense, this forum has also catalyzed a transatlantic relationship which was dying, courtesy the recent developments. And the Naval Postgraduate School will be there in force in August this year, where I think Ishan is going to be there. Your son Ishan is going to be one of the young fellows undertaking that program. So the idea here is basically to, of course, communicate our ideas, our fears, our aspirations, our ambitions around the relationship, but also in many ways to inform each other of what the thinking is in our own communities in DC, in Delhi, and the associated cities that care about foreign policy. That's the purpose of this particular forum. Tomorrow morning we'll be joined by, of course, the 2 joint secretaries. There's going to be a presentation around the nuclear posture review. There is going to be a conversation on nuclear security, and the nuclear security and the nuclear policy theme is going to be, I think, the most important aspect of this year's program. So this is where we are vis-a-vis the program. Paul will, of course, give the formal address tomorrow morning to the rest of us on what we are doing.
Paul knows more about nuclear than I do, so I'm happy to leave that subject to him anyway.
But let me start by talking to you about 3 relationships: U.S., China, Pakistan together, and of course the most recent visit of the Prime Minister to Israel. So first with the U.S. relationship, and you have been following this particular bilateral. How would you see this relationship today, post the meeting between the 2 leaders a few weeks ago?
Assuming this is all amongst us, right? We're being fair. On the record, quotable on, okay.
On the record. So that will make you more provocative, so go ahead.
Yes, I'll try and be suitably provocative, but still be a little better behaved. No, I think honestly a bit uncertain. I would say the visit has gone well, but that's because the bar for the expectations from the visit was set very low, and it was set very low largely because of the uncertainty surrounding Mr. Trump's personal reflexes on foreign policy. I think it's very clear that everyone in Delhi was quite taken aback by the extraordinary turnaround on China that followed Mr. President Xi Jinping's visit to Mar-a-Lago. And there was a sudden sense that you really couldn't assume that any of your rational deductions about the Trump administration's posture on issues involving India's vital interests, that any of those assumptions could continue to be taken for granted, that he did seem able to turn on a dime on some of his own previous positions and appointments. He had been seen as having appointed a fairly hardline set of advisors on China, and there he was in an absolute love fest at Mar-a-Lago and after. I think the Indians were anxious that a personal rapport should be established. There hadn't been one earlier, and it was important that it be created because of the perception that the president functions in a very personalized manner. And I think by and large the feeling is that it has been established, that it may not be a total bromance as Modi enjoyed with Obama, but it certainly seems to have been positive enough, and the echoes of that were seen when Trump moved over to say hello to Modi in Hamburg at the G20 in a way that suggested a certain special attention. On the substance, I think it's fair to say, and I should stress for our American friends that though I chair a Foreign Affairs Committee, I'm from the opposition. In our system, 8 of our 24 committees are chaired by opposition members of Parliament, and the Foreign Affairs Committee traditionally has always been chaired by an opposition member. So I speak as a critic, a domestic critic of the government and of the Prime Minister. I will say that I think many of us feel that India didn't get very much out of the trip, that Mr. Modi certainly gave the Americans a lot of what Mr. Trump wanted to hear. The purchase of the Guardian drones for the Navy was actually approved already by the Obama administration. So I'm not sure that I give any particular credit to the Trump administration for going through with it. In fact, reversal would have been something that would have hurt the relationship, so they continued with it. But again, that's something that should make America happy. It does, in fact, enable the president to say that Indian purchases are helpful. I believe I've read a figure somewhere, maybe challengeable, that 200,000 American jobs are sustained by exports to India. So that's not a bad figure, and that's something which I think India can quite cheerfully point to, given the sort of transactional thinking in the president's immediate circles. Beyond that, India certainly didn't even raise in a big way some of its vital concerns about, for example, H-1B visas. It sensed that immigration was going to be a negative issue to raise with its president, simply chose not to make an issue of it. But that did let down the many in India had hoped it would be raised as a significant issue. And when it comes to other matters, for example, the US statements consistently called on India to do certain things about its regulations, about market access, about reducing certain barriers, pharmaceutical companies and so on, but it did nothing, for example, to reflect what India could offer the US, such as if barriers were eased when it came to India providing services and individual experts and so on. So I think anyone looking very carefully, parsing the joint statement that was issued, looking at the nuts and bolts of what was actually done rather than the sort of usual rhetoric that accompanies it, would see this as one where the US came out all right. They should have had no reason to be unhappy, where at least a personal connection was established, but absolutely nothing tangible or concrete was accomplished by the government of India or by the Prime Minister.
Let me actually put forward 3 themes that were important for India going in, which you could argue were adequately ticked, considering that this was a feel-good visit or a state-setting visit, and you were not really expecting anything substantive to come out of it. Let's look at China. The joint statement follows word for word India's position on the Belt and Road Initiative. They've actually picked up, if someone is, you can accuse someone of doing a shoddy job by actually cutting and pasting the statement from the MEA statement into the declaration. So on China, they actually ticked the box. They gave you enough. Second, so 3 areas. Second, on Pakistan, I think they've done what every other administration has done. In fact, even before you reach there, they declared someone a offender and in the terrorist list.
As they say in New York, that and 65 cents will get you a cup of coffee.
And that's what
they've declared Salahuddin, globally wanted terrorist or something.
No, but that's what.
But they've said nothing about the government that gives him shelter, succor, assistance, and money. So if the government that does all that is somehow not tarnished by this label, what is the label worth?
Again, I'm saying they have done precisely what any new president would have done. If you were to go back to Obama's initial 2 years, I do not think you got too much. more from Obama while he was settling in. And the third was around energy. Again, on energy, I think, considering the fact that India had taken a contrary stand and had said that we will pursue our renewable energy agenda and the climate deal, they were still forthcoming and were speaking about coal and gas, something that you do need. It is something important for you. So I think if you look at these three big areas.
Okay, let me push back a little bit on this. I mean, I understand where you're coming from. On China, yeah, there was a vague allusion to the Indo-Pacific.
Not
as
vague
well.
allusion.
To the Indo-Pacific?
Yes, to the Indo-Pacific, yes,
But there wasn't, obviously, no longer, I mean, the previous time Obama had asked India to subscribe to the American formulation on the South China Sea, but the fact that Trump has dropped that formulation on the South China Sea is no longer apparently a matter of concern on which they want the Indians to go along with them. That too suggests a certain warming to China that we can't be terribly happy about. On Belt and Road Initiative, don't forget America attended the conference, India didn't. So, yes, you're right. The language is certainly unexceptionable as far as India is concerned, but nor is there any expression of understanding for India's concerns and staying out of that initiative. When it comes to Pakistan, as I said, the designation of Salahuddin means absolutely nothing when there is no condemnation of the government that enables and empowers and finances the guy and his terrorist activities. So, to be honest, the US has played this game too long, and I say this very bluntly to Americans here, of rhetorical, empty condemnation of terrorist activities with no tangible action against those who actually enable, empower, finance, equip, and arm these terrorists. So, as far as I'm concerned, honestly, fine.
So fair enough.
We can take this in, but it's really not worth as much as it should.
Fair enough. So
and your third point was
energy.
Energy
And climate,
on
despite
energy,
having. Yeah.
Given President Trump's press conference in which he wrongly and unjustifiably characterized India as essentially a freeloader on global energy policies, I must say that what we got was the absolute minimum. There should have been some acknowledgement of India's efforts to contribute in a constructive way to reversing the effects of climate change. But since the president doesn't even believe there is any climate change, he wasn't inclined to do that. But he had gone to the other extreme by, he could have picked 10 other examples.
He decided to pick up India and China. So, no, fair enough.
So, I honestly don't think there's much to celebrate. There isn't anything to be unhappy about. We don't have a disaster on our hands, but we don't have a lot to be celebrating.
Fair enough. So I have, in one of my writings, suggested that, like every Indian Prime Minister who wants to believe he could settle Pakistan in his first 2 years in office, every American president also believes he can settle China. And I think we need to go through those first 2 years, and then you will see all roads lead to New Delhi when you start thinking about Asia. I think strategic patience was the term I used, and it's time India allows a fractious democracy like the US that space that they have given us being one ourselves. So, but Shashi, let's move to the next relationship. I think China was what you were alluding to. I think that's a problem, right? That's one of India's biggest challenges. US is still someone with whom you generally have a positive trajectory. It's how much we get from them and how much we give to them and the nature of trade and strategic conversations. China is a neighbor. China is huge. China is 6 times your size. And China is on the move. And China is unyielding. And how does India respond to a neighbor like China?
Well, I think there's been a certain amount of mismanagement from New Delhi of this relationship. If you look at the fact that for 25 years, there was a significantly warming relationship, the economics were the obvious area, 230 times increase in trade from 25 years ago to 2014, from a couple of $100 million to 70 billion. You've seen great warmth in the political language around the relationship. We've seen a willingness to resolve the irritants that inevitably crop up given China's undoubtedly very different strategic interests in the subcontinent and its need for Pakistan to be a loyal ally. And despite all of that, we managed to get along reasonably well. In the last couple of years, there's definitely been a slip back. I don't only blame the government of India. Obviously, both parties have been pushing their own interests in ways that have been inimical to the others. But the fact is that we are in a position now where India-China relations are at a historic low. I don't think since 1962 we have seen the kind of rhetoric addressed to us by publications owned by either the Communist Party or the government of China that we've seen in the last few weeks. It's been quite astonishing. Secondly, we've found ourselves in a position where there is an actual standoff on a physical frontier, with both sides pitching tents and refusing to budge.
No tents.
Tents. Take my word for it. Tents on both sides. You can ask your sources. And on top of that, we are looking at a situation in which there doesn't seem to be an easy way. China's posturing, including the official spokesman of the foreign ministry, has put us in a position where India has in other words, the onus is entirely on India to blink, but no self-respecting Indian government can blink. I mean, it's also pretty bad policy on the part of China not to have formulated things in a way that we could have gracefully climbed down. And you saw the very ungracious way in which the brief encounter between the two leaders in Hamburg was reported by the Chinese, whereas the Indians published the photograph which showed Mr. Modi being very friendly and Mr. Xi with a sort of half smile that didn't quite crack.
That's a permanent expression.
Whatever it may be, at least we talked about it and said it was a very constructive exchange or something. The Chinese bluntly said nothing was discussed. There was no meeting, quote unquote. Well, the photograph is there, but the Chinese said there was no meeting. So you are looking at a situation where the hostility from their side is quite palpable. And I'm not sure where this gets us and why we've allowed it to get to this point. The fact is that we've always tried to play a fairly careful game. That is that we are warming to the US. There are all sorts of good, sensible, strategic reasons why we should. But we've always made it clear to the US as well that we cannot be expected to pursue any other country's agenda when it comes to.
So let me ask you a direct question.
So
some argue
we've
that
taken
China,
our eye off the ball.
Some argue that China's new avatar does not see any possibility of multipolarity in Asia. They do not believe a multipolar Asia is a stable Asia. They believe a multipolar world is stable, but the only regional hegemon will happen to be sitting in Beijing. And I believe that is something that is new. It is not something that existed in 2009 when they were proposing the BRICS and others, when they were supporting the BRICS program and other. That's a very new Chinese posture for the last 4 or 5 years. How can you deal with someone who does not want to give you the space to be at least a regional power?
The Chinese have actually two objectives. You may be right about this one, though I'm not sure I totally buy it. But they need partners for the first objective. That is, for example, when the Chinese, irritated by the failure of the US Senate to ratify what was agreed in Pittsburgh in 2008 on the shifting of the weighted vote in the Bretton Woods institutions, said, let's set up a new development bank. They couldn't do it on their own. They already had the Asian Infrastructure Bank. They had to do it with India and other countries going along. And therefore, they needed a kind of relationship that would make it possible and interesting enough for India to say, yes, we'll do this with you. And what's more, we'll provide the first president and so on and so forth. And the New Development Bank is an example of how the objective of a multipolar world requires recognizing
Chinese leadership,
but
in the new institutions that are set up.
Well, the institution is still 20% each, you see.
That's right.
So the 5 BRICS countries are all giving 20% each. The Chinese have the location. India has the president who gets to make the decisions. And on top of that, the Chinese have to acknowledge a certain amount of equality. So what I'm saying is that both objectives are there. Both objectives are there.
And I alluded to that when I said in 2008, Chinese did believe they needed to collaborate with a bunch of other countries to ensure
they waited till 2015 to do the BRICS Bank.
That's right, but from 2012 New Delhi. 2012 in the Delhi Declaration we agreed to set up the new development bank. 2013 it was announced. So it is actually something that flows from that moment, the global financial crisis, which was decisively pounced on by the Chinese. They created a bunch of a group of emerging countries.
But we have actually a shared interest with the Chinese.
I agree.
What the Chinese are saying to the rest of the world, the powers of 1945 who won the Second World War, is, look, if you won't give us a level playing field, we'll go and build our own playing field. Yeah. And that's something that India actually dearly needs to associate itself with, because we're not getting a level playing field, for example,
they don't allow you to play on that field
Security Council.
My point is, do you believe they will give you fair share of that playing field? And I think that's the point.
That's the problem we have right now. So the problem we have right now in the last few weeks is we've got ourselves to a point where very clearly they don't see us as a partner at all. They see us in very, very hostile and negative terms.
So what's the next step for someone sitting?
Well,
in
where do
Delhi?
we turn? I mean, the US apparently is itself no longer so sure that it wants a counterbalance with China. I mean, at the moment, the American attitude to China, at least judging by President Trump's tweets, is all about North Korea and nothing else. If the Chinese manage to get good behavior out of North Korea, then as far as President Trump is concerned, they're good guys. And so where does that leave us for having warmed up to the US as a force of influence vis-a-vis
then
China?
I'll come to the
We
next
have to
country.
come back to our own relationship with China and make it work.
So then let me go to the last relationship where we can turn to Israel. I'm now I'm being a little frivolous, but let me come to the last country before we throw it open, the India-Israel relationship. And I'm not necessarily comparing it with the importance of the other two that we have discussed. In fact, the three: the Pakistan, Chinese, and the American relationship. But certainly it signifies a new moment in Indian foreign policy. And it's as symbolic as real, in a sense that you have decided to do away with certain assumptions and fundamental postures that India had stuck by for 7 decades since independence. Coming from a party who was seen to be shy of embracing the contemporary realities, making that relationship with Israel central to India's years ahead. How do you feel about this? The bromance that you were mentioning, you've witnessed in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, right?
Well, look, on this one, I actually am much less critical of the government than you would expect, given which party I belong to, because I believe that this is a sensible and mature recognition of an evolution in relations with Israel. Israel is giving us a heck of a lot that nobody else is. And you know, it's a smallish country which has tremendous, I mean, if you want to think in transactional terms, tremendous, very concrete benefits to India, whether it's in terms of agricultural cooperation, whether it's in terms of IT and startups, or whether it's in terms of defense, security, and counterterrorism, especially the last. Now, having said that, I still think that the way in which the government did it vindicates the point that I have made, which is that essentially they made sure that Mr. Modi had gone to 2 or 3 Arab countries earlier. He's been to the UAE, he's been to Saudi Arabia.
He has a very aggressive and proactive diplomacy with the Arab world.
With the Arab world. And what is more, I think even the best thing about all of this was that the Palestine President Mahmoud Abbas was invited to India just 2 months before. He was here in May. And I'd be astonished if our friends in the MEA didn't take him aside and say, look, this is going to happen. We have a trip coming up. It will not include, for the first time, a visit to Ramallah. And we hope you don't misunderstand. Our commitment to a just solution for Palestine is still intact. Now, as long as that last bit is there, I think we can go along with this policy change. I think this is frankly the way in which I would have liked to see any Indian government handle this relationship. I do believe principles matter, and I do believe that the Palestinians are due justice, and that the solution the UN has talked about, that India has consistently voted for, of 2 states living side by side behind, you know, defensible borders and in a viable security arrangement, this is still the best outcome. But whether that becomes increasingly viable thanks to the policies of Israel is a problem we'll deal with separately. But right now, that remains our position, and we've said to the Palestinians, we are not backing off from that. Indeed, we have built the Palestinians an embassy in Delhi, and we continue to give them financial assistance, and I think moral and political assistance up to a point. We no longer reflexively join the condemnations of Israel on everything, but to a great extent, we have signaled very effectively to the Palestinians that we are there with them. Very clearly, however, that the optics of the visit can be interpreted both ways. I choose to see it as merely the kind of dehyphenation of Israel and Palestine that we want foreign visitors to respect in dehyphenating us and Pakistan. We got rather exasperated every time a world leader kept coming to Delhi and feeling he is obliged to stop by in Islamabad on the way there or the way back. And increasingly we expect leaders to just come and see us. And I think in the same way, it's entirely reasonable for us to say the Palestinians will come and see you sometime. Maybe Modi will go to Jordan or Egypt and stop by Ramallah, and he should. In the next couple of years would not be a bad thing to do. Just to say that it's not anti-Palestine, this visit, but a decoupling, a dehyphenation. And I think that's something that we can do. So on Israel, I actually don't personally criticize the government much. I think that on this one, it's a reflection of where that relationship, which has been tended to by governments of all parties over the last 25 years, has evolved.
So you would give them high marks for the relationship with Israel, fair marks for the relationship with the US, and they score poorly in managing the Chinese relationship. This is basically what Dr. Shashi Tharoor tells us this evening. I'm going to be opening it up to all of you. Again, the non-Indian ones, I know the Indians are itching to contradict him. Ashok Malik wants to change the China score immediately. But Raji wants to do that as well. But I want to call Paul or Jim or please. Joshua, why don't you come in? Please. Joshua has worked on South Asia for so long, he's half Indian. He likes the mic as well. Go ahead.
Do let me know who you guys are when you ask your question or make your comment.
I was at the White House before that. I was wondering if you could speak to India's relationship with Russia and how that fits with the other three relationships that Samir asked you about. You obviously know what's happening in Washington's relationship with Moscow, which is ugly at the moment. But also looking at the region, the United States has been increasingly vocal about what we see as Russia's malign activity in Afghanistan and some growing ties between Russia and Pakistan. If you could speak to how India sees those.
Well, I'm worried.
those
I mean, I certainly, I think many of us would tell you that we're worried about the way things are going with Russia. There was, in the last couple of years, a very noticeable warming of relations between Russia and China, to begin with the Russians more and more inclined to see themselves as sharing common worldview with China. It manifested itself in a number of common Security Council votes of the UN, but more important, I think, in some fairly clear parallel messaging on issues of interest to China, including this warming with Pakistan to which you allude. The military exercise with Pakistan, I don't know to what extent they were a shock to the Indian defense establishment, but to many people observing this, and particularly since some of it happened in territory that we claim to be our sovereign territory. So this is something the Russians hadn't done to us before, and it was something we needed to worry about. We didn't think it had much to do with Pakistan's love, Russia's love of Pakistan, but much more to do with their desire to show the Chinese that they were in the,
or the Americans that they were playing with their Cold War allies.
No, I think it was more about the Chinese, honestly. Then we had the interesting phenomenon of President Trump's known fondness for Russia, his fond statements of Putin, the assumption that the Russians had been anxious to see him elected, and the perception soon after his election that you would see a major change in Washington-Moscow relations. And that would have suggested to many of us that if the US warmed with Moscow, and it was an increasingly anti-Chinese US, judging by the statements Mr. Trump made and the people he appointed and so on, then this would be a source of relief to us because the growing Chinese-Russian closeness would certainly be diluted because obviously given a choice, the Russians would rather be having warming relations with Washington than having warming relations with Beijing. So for a while, I think we allowed ourselves to think that this particular worry that many of us were feeling in the course of 2016, that worry could ease up. But as we know, what happened was, first of all, Mr. Trump's instincts for warmer relations with Russia have been hobbled by the multifarious investigations into his campaign's conduct and everything else, and the resignation of his national security advisor and all of that that's been taking place. And I think clearly his hands are much more tied than he would like in terms of how much he can change things with Russia. This wonderfully interesting pullback on his tweet after meeting President Putin and saying they discussed a common policy, which then, of course, he had 2 days later to announce was no longer a feasible policy. This suggests that very clearly his hands are tied and he knows it. That means, of course, that if there isn't going to be a new US-Russia entente, that the Russia-China entente will continue to be more than cordial. And that is something that I think we do need to worry about. What can India do to reassure Russia that we haven't forgotten our old interests and sympathies? I honestly don't know, because we are, for example, diversifying on arms purchases. We are getting stuff from the US and Israel and so on that 10 years ago we might have got from Russia. And the Russians know that. We've also not had a terribly good experience with the one big defense purchase we made from the Russians, where their price overruns have now become almost comically insulting. So I mean, I'm not sure, honestly, what we can say or do that will make the Russians rethink their orientation. Right now, the Chinese look more and more as if they're more important to the Russians than we are, and that if we're looking at a situation globally where those two countries will have more to do with each other, it could partly be at our expense. And I think we do need to pay a great deal of attention to this, because we really can't afford to have an ill-disposed Moscow. And I'm certainly hoping this is a very high priority for the Mandarins in the Foreign Office. We have a couple of retired Mandarins here who could probably speak to this with more insight than I can, but this is important.
Someone else want to come in? Because I know Ashok has come all the way to ask him a question. Ashok, you want to ask a question, right?
You just told all the Indians to shut up and not ask questions, and now you're giving...
No, I just remembered Ashok told
an...
me, he told me, I'm coming this evening just to ask him a question. Go ahead.
He just recovered from a bad virus.
Yeah. He hasn't... Oh my God. Guys, we need to leave the room.
Catching.
Sorry.
Should I go ahead?
Yeah.
Shashi, you worked in the multilateral system. You worked in the UN for many years before you became a politician. As you alluded in your remarks, the post-war liberal multilateral system, of which the UN is a part, was a happy moment in human history. There is this sense that perhaps it was a happy aberration in human history, and now the international system has reverted to a more Hobbesian normal. Is that an overly cynical view, or is it a realist view? And either way, how does India cope with a 10 to 15-year horizon in mind?
Well, no, I think that your judgment is premature if that is your judgment. I mean, I think Robert Kagan would probably agree with you, right? I mean, there's some people who see the world as Hobbesian and the UN as an aberration. But for the rest of us, I think that's a premature conclusion, for the simple reason that that the system exists. It is underpinned by a whole series of treaties, international laws, organizations, systems, to which a startlingly large number of countries subscribe. So it's not as if, if you look at the way in which the League of Nations collapsed at the end of the 1930s, the expulsions of a few, the withdrawals of a few others, you could see the blessed thing crumbling. You haven't got to the beginning of a crumble yet at the UN, so I wouldn't worry. But I do worry about two or three other things. The first and biggest worry I have, which I think Samir also shares, and we've been talking about putting this into a book, is the worry that the winners of 45, who therefore became the top dogs, as it were, of the international system, do not have the statesmanship or the breadth of vision to accommodate new people at the high table. And this is interesting because unlike, say, Germany and Japan at the beginning of the 20th century, who really did threaten the established order, countries like India and China and others have absolutely no desire to upset the international system. They just want a place in it. They were seeking to be admitted, but these guys aren't moving their elbows. And you know very well in international affairs that you're either at the table or on the menu. And the fact is that countries like India on all issues and China on economic issues, because they already had the high table politically, will feel rightly that they've had enough of being rule takers and they want to be rule makers as well. And the inability of the countries who are custodians of the system to see that it's in their interest to make accommodations for a few new players is, to my mind, the biggest worry we have in the international system now. Imagine a situation 10 years, 15 years from now, where, for example, there are sanctions on a country in southern Africa without consulting South Africa, or one of our neighbors is sanctioned without India being consulted. Do you think we're going to honor these sanctions? I mean, do you think that we will feel that this body with a veto for the British and the French and not even a seat for us is worth honoring? And the moment we don't honor it, the credibility of the entire international system that underpins it goes down the tubes, and then it'll be too late for countries like the US and others to say, what happened to the order we constructed? So my plea to the Americans here would be definitely to work within their systems to encourage a greater sense of accommodation. I do believe there were voices in the last administration that saw that. I do not see or hear any similar
Too
voices
early.
in the present administration.
Strategic patience.
Perhaps. No, I mean,
So-
we obviously many appointments are not there and many other things are
Yeah.
not there.
Wait for the tweet.
Wait for the...
Mike? Jim? There's a mic behind you.
Shashi, you are a great practitioner of realpolitik. Listening to this, it's really an incredible presentation. But 15, 20 years from now, I think India will have a seat at the table. I really do. It's.
But
here.
I heard that 15, 20 years ago when I was at the
but
US.
I think it's happening now. I really do think it's happening now. But you've got to be willing to take the seat, right? You've got to be willing to exercise that role.
Now, there I agree with you. And since Samir was kind enough to plug my book, Pax Indica, let me mention one of its central conclusions and exhortations is precisely that we should be more willing to step up to the plate. That we have, for example, on everything from cybersecurity to from cyberspace to outer space, we have the technology, the expertise, the human resources, and the money required to step up and actually play a role in shaping global systems and responses to the challenges in these areas. But we're not doing it. We're not stepping up. We're not showing the courage of the initiative. I'm personally disappointed that we have been so absent from any of the peacemaking that the world has needed in the last 20 years, whereas in fact in the 50s and 60s we were almost the default country. Laos, call Nehru. Vietnam, call Nehru. When the American pilots were kidnapped or captured by the Chinese after the plane was shot down, Hammarskjöld came, call Nehru. I mean, the whole thing was India was the mediator of choice. We are simply nowhere there. And I think certainly even whether it is the recent mess in the Middle East where Kuwait is compromised by its own relationships but is by default a mediator, we could have stepped in, between Qatar and the others. We have good relations with all of them, and we have stakes in all of them. We're absent. Certainly when it comes to the completely stagnant peace process between Israel and the Palestinians, our voice is totally irrelevant, and so it goes. So I feel a certain level of frustration that we are punching so far below our weight in global affairs. And yes, I therefore agree totally with you, and I've been arguing this. As I said, my book, Pax Indica, was published in 2012 and is available in all good bookstores. But the truth is that it
discount.
It is a case that has not resonated.
Mike, two finger.
Nasty man.
Just a two-finger on this. But, Shashi, I think you could argue that symbolically, from the standpoint of rhetoric and so on, yes, India played this unique role before, but it was a rhetorical role, right? I mean, if you compare that role now, I mean, maybe it doesn't have the cachet that it had before in that sense. But when was India more important as a strategic player, right? Then or now? Right?
No,
So if you
potentially
look at
we could be more
And if you
important.
look at it from the standpoint of the United States, like let's say that the U.S. is sort of the ultimate realpolitik player, right? I mean, now, from the U.S. standpoint, right? I mean, why is it that we're courting India now and not before? Why is it that India is sort of seen as this linchpin in the future architecture of the Asia-Pacific region in a way that it wasn't? Maybe it's not this sort of rhetorical leader in the way that it was in the past, but it's actually, has a role that matters now.
Paul, two fingers back at you. It was much more than rhetorical. Take the Suez Crisis, which definitely affected the actual, real strategic interests of the Western powers. India played a hugely significant role, and it did so at a time when various people needed face-saving climb downs. And let's face it, we haven't played anything remotely like our role in the Suez Crisis today. And there's also definitely the setting up the International Control Commission in Indochina, the Laos-Vietnam thing where India played an instrumental role, the release of the American pilots, etc. There are too many examples where it wasn't just rhetoric. There was actual concrete intervention that was of strategic benefit to the great powers, the superpowers in those days. And And there's nothing like that now. I don't disagree with you that in terms of economics and in terms of our GDP and our weight in the world.
And capabilities, and real
Yeah, but
capabilities.
capability is the problem. We have the capability, but where is it being exercised? It doesn't. We're not making enough of a difference.
Admiral Prakash.
Yeah, thank you. Then, Mr. Tharoor, are you then saying that
How are you?
there's been no Indian thinker after Jawaharlal Nehru, with the exception of yourself?
I'd be very
I
happy
mean,
to. Happy to
No,
concede there are many others.
The point I'm making is that you think and write and so on, but the average Indian politician from where I've been is so preoccupied with electoral politics that he has no time or mental space to spare for any strategizing. And I'm not just talking about defense strategy. Strategy in any sphere of India's life and future, there has been none. So when you spoke of cyberspace and so on, we've got technologies, but zero strategies.
That's right.
So can you rationalize this, I mean, for a country of 1.25 billion people?
But this is what I've been banging my head against the wall about, Admiral Saab. You may recall when I was in my very brief stint in the Foreign Ministry, when I convened that consultation on the Indian Ocean, and your foundation was represented. I think you came personally, did you not? Yeah. I mean, it was a first. We actually got around a table, the Foreign Secretary, along with all the senior officials of the Ministry of External Affairs, think tanks, foundations, the Defense Ministry, and we actually for once sat down and tried to come up with a strategic approach to the Indian Ocean. Sadly, I was not able to pursue that initiative beyond the point, but it was the example of the kind of thing that I believe we have the capacity to do and we could do on issue after issue. Why have we been historically reluctant? I think partly you're right. Our politics is inevitably focused on the domestic. By the way, that's not so untrue of America either. I mean, the famous statistic that only, I think, 65% of the US Congress didn't have passports. That was not so long ago. I don't know if the figure's very much better now. But most politicians will think about what will resonate with their voters, and foreign policy relatively rarely does. So that is a genuine problem. But on the other hand, we have the benefit of extraordinary minds, talents, thinkers, writers, all the people I failed to cite, available in our country to do that thinking. You don't have to ask. You don't have to expect the politicians to do that thinking. You could have experts to do it, provided the politicians have the political courage to take the decision to then act on that. Sadly, even this government, and I say even because this government has tried to articulate a vision and so on foreign policy, it has not been bold at all. And I would say that this is now very clear after 3 years that on none of these issues
So
have
as
we
someone
seen
who
initiative
works in a
taken by
think
the
tank,
government.
and I think some of my colleagues like Tino, who's sitting there, Constantino, you'll be interacting with him tomorrow, they probably agree with me that, and I'm not saying this is anything to do with 2014 elections, but I think in the last 5 or 6 years, which includes the end of the previous government as well, we have seen a far greater interaction taking place in New Delhi between think tanks, the research community, and government. I think it is a trend which is on the up.
How will this translate itself into policy initiatives?
Let me give you a very concrete example, which is fresh. The Indian Prime Minister, the Indian Foreign Minister, they have all endorsed something called the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. Where does this come from? It is a 2-month-old report published by RIS and ERIA. So if this is not policy responding to research, then nothing can be. A 2-month-old research is being put into what is the Raisina dialogue? India was very shy of getting involved in calling and having these spectacles of conversations. It was that conversation that started in 2013-14, which this government concluded, and decided that we want our own Munich Security Conference. We want our own platforms where we will call our own people and create our own. So I think I'm not specifically focusing on 2014. I'm saying this is happening. Yes, it could happen faster, but I tell everyone, the tax to GDP ratio of India is a third of any other G20 country, which means the real state capacity to deploy resources in many areas, including social policy and foreign policy and other policies, is always going to be less than ideal. And hence, there will have to be a partnership model between the private sector, between institutions and NGOs and governments, who will have to catalyze.
Well, the tax to GDP ratio is going up. As a taxpayer, I can tell you that.
So, last questions, maybe one or two. Mike, I know, is Anyone else? Tino. So we'll finish with Tino, the youngest and the best looking Indian foreign policy proponent. But Mike, before it's to you. Paul too, but Paul, you're American now, so Tino has taken it.
The best looking comment was saved for someone else. How's that? I know, I just said you saved the best looking comment for someone else.
Samir just desperately wants it. You give it to him.
You sort of suggested India deserves a seat at the table, and Dean Wirtz said, don't worry, you'll get one in 15 years. Or take it. What would India do if it had a seat at the table? And we talk about China has a seat at the table, but it seems the most disruptive things that China is doing are not based or not coming from its seat at that table, but from things that it's doing on its own, with the projection of military force, with the use of the economic resources that it has amassed. And so I'm wondering, I guess, number one, what would India do if it had a seat at the table, whether that comes in 15 years, or 30 years, or 2 years? And if India doesn't get a seat at the table, is it prepared to use the resources that it's accumulated to do something as dramatic as what China has been doing?
Okay, so wait, before you answer, let me add a third part to it. Are we looking at ourselves as defenders of the liberal order, inheritors of the liberal order, or are we going to be disruptors of that order, aka China?
That's an interesting question. I'll come to it in a second, but let me answer the first part, which is that I think that at the moment, the honest answer, if we were all to look ourselves in the mirror, is we don't know. That is that at the moment, and not just at the moment, for the last 25 years, India has been seeking that place as a recognition of what it is and where it has arrived, rather than as an instrument to do something particular with it. I would hope that if it were to get that seat, it would realize it has to do something to justify it, and that somebody would pick out my Pax Indica and realize that all these things in which India can start taking initiatives and assert itself on the world stage. But jokes apart, the truth is that that there are very highly placed individuals in our polity and our bureaucracy who have said to me over the years, thank God we don't have a seat in the Security Council, so we don't have to take a position on this, whatever that this was, because taking a position, many of them felt, was far worse than remaining silent. And there is a certain diffidence built into our system, which I think cuts across political parties, cuts across generations of the bureaucracy, and would have to be overcome by a conscious political choice to be more assertive, more interventionist, more original, more creative, which frankly, since Nehru, I would agree there with Admiral Prakash, I don't think since Nehru anybody has had that instinct, anybody in power has had that instinct to go ahead and be interventionist. There are many critics of Nehru.
Until Modi.
Well, we thought he might be, but he hasn't yet. You have to point to one creative, original intervention by Mr. Modi in the world affairs stage before I can agree with you. Now that comes to your question, which is a genuinely difficult one. Would India see itself as a defender of the liberal order? I would give a very sotto voce yes. That is that I think India recognizes it has a lot of vested interests in maintaining a stable global system. And to that degree, India would want, therefore, to stand up for preserving that system and making it work. India would never, I think, at least not for the foreseeable future, be an aggressive interventionist proponent of the liberal order, even with our own democracy. We wait for countries to ask us to send election observers or to send people to help them with. We are simply not interested in exporting democracy. In fact, just this week, there's been a thing that's going around the internet quite a bit by a poor Thai scholar. No, the Thai scholar.
Nothing poor about him. He took my hospitality, flew down to India, decided not to attend the conference.
Because
and
you
went back.
disinvited him.
That's not true. That's not true, but you will hear the rejoinder to that in a bit.
I've only read his version, but all I can say is it suggests that India is much more interested.
That's the state of narratives today. You hear one side and make up your mind. But,
Tino.
Right.
I will ask you for your side in due course. But we're far away, in other words, from taking on an interventionist posture, even in defense of the liberal order. It will come perhaps one day, but then we may need certain political developments to facilitate that, and have some of us pushing those developments in power rather than in opposition. Sir.
Well, just on exporting democracy,
Tina.
India has been actually assisting democracies left and right since the 1950s. That's a story which just shows, I think many people are not aware here in India.
So has been what democracy?
India's been assisting,
Assisting, yeah,
exporting.
yeah,
Look at
absolutely.
Nepal 51 to 60. India
Absolutely.
built up a regime. India intervened, toppled the regime.
Only at
supported.
the request.
51. No, not a request. I mean, you flew in. You hijacked a king out of Kathmandu in the December 1950. I mean, there was a coercion left and right in the
You're spreading
region
canards
to
about
support my same 1980.
We have a former
same-
ambassador to Nepal right here who will
Sa-
educate you, Tina.
Same in the 1980s in Sri Lanka. 30 years ago, you forced the Sri Lankan regime to accept a liberal experiment in Sri Lanka. And that's a good story, it's a bad story. But exactly 30 years ago, we had Mirage escorted Antonov 32s, violating the sovereign airspace of Sri Lanka.
By
and
dropping humanitarian supplies in Jaffna as well.
violating the sovereign airspace of Sri Lanka.
He's talking about the interventionist streak,
And
which
there
is
was
fair
this-
enough. When it comes to our core our neighborhood and areas that we believe are our core interests, we have shown interventionist.
So just on the neighborhood, my question
No,
is...
in fact, these have been exceptions. I'll give you one more which you add to your litany, and that's when Aung San Suu Kyi was
Sikkim.
arrested in 1990 and the Burmese junta overthrew the results of the election. India did give refuge to some of the students who were able to escape, help them set up a radio station, publish a newspaper.
And it was
So
ready
we-
to recognize the
Yeah,
government.
but after
in
6
exile.
years, when we saw the Pakistanis were getting concessions in Burma, real politics succeeded very quickly.
So just on the neighborhood, the scorecard, I wonder, Shashi, what your scorecard is on the neighborhood. And I mean, you have the first ever bilateral visit in 20 years to Nepal of the Prime Minister. You have the first ever bilateral visit to Sri Lanka in 30 years of the Prime Minister. You have a line boundary agreement, which, true, comes back from the 1970s, but is finally pushed through. You have an
I had a role
excellent
in
relation
that.
with Bangladesh. And you finally have a real new policy of bringing in external powers, whether the Japanese, the Singaporeans, the Australians, the Americans, the Brits, into the region and working together with them in third countries. So signing agreements, sharing
Bilateral
assessments, etc.
cooperation format.
Is that enough for an excellent for you on the neighborhood?
Yeah, I think in the neighborhood we're not doing badly at all. And in fact, obviously there are limitations and frustrations, and I'm also very, very conscious of the fact that we can't always judge India as the principal cause of any problems in a bilateral relationship. We are the bigger country, and you know that famous line from Porfirio Diaz about who said, "What is it, my poor country, so close to so far from God and so close to the United States." I mean, most small countries have a problem with big countries. I mean, so the truth is that we are going to be undoubtedly the object of a certain amount of resentment from smaller neighbors. But given that, I do agree we haven't done too badly. And such problems as have arisen have not arisen because of Indian policy failures or diplomatic failures. With a brief exception, I think the so-called blockade of Nepal, that's a totally different issue, but I think that's another example of an overstretched Prime Minister's office taking its eye off the diplomatic ball. But that's a totally different conversation, and it was a finite period, fortunately. But with that exception, I agree with you on the subcontinent generally. We have a pretty good scorecard, and there's some interesting sub-regional initiatives coming up that I would like to see evolving. The BBIN, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal. There is also BIMSTEC, which has been taken out of mothballs and given a new sort of sheen, which could actually develop very interestingly. In fact, just by tossing Maldives into the mix, you would essentially have SAARC minus Pakistan, which could be a salutary way of moving forward. But I mean, minus Pakistan plus Thailand, but I mean, the concept is the same. There's a great deal that could be done, and that seems to be being done. And I do believe the potential is enormous. But unfortunately, as the World Bank tells you, we are still the least integrated region on the planet, South Asia. So we've done well, but we have a lot better we still need to do.
So I just got a message on my phone. There are two fact checkers. There are two fact checks that are required, and I'm going to give the mic to Ambassador Sood. I think one is on the Russian exercises, the Russian exercises, and the second is on Nepal. Ambassador Sood. I think you had 2 points to make. Short ones. Fact checks. These are just fact checks.
No. I think the first thing I needed to correct Constantino was on the fact that the king took refuge in the Indian embassy, and since he couldn't stay in the Indian embassy indefinitely, we had no choice but to actually fly him out. So I think, Yeah, to Hyderabad House, which is where he was then
So that's
lodged.
fact check. That's why,
So,
I always, I don't
mean,
believe in CNN anymore. I always look at the Twitter to know what's happening here. Go ahead. Second.
The second one was, what was the second fact that you
The second
wanted
was
to-
Russians exercising in
Oh, well,
POK.
the Russians originally said that they would exercise in disputed territory, but eventually they didn't. So that was a correction.
But it was
for you.
announced, as you know.
It
that
was
they-
announced, but then they did not. They exercised in NWFP.
Right. Apparently, however, they landed there, transited through it, and went to NW.
No, they didn't.
No?
They didn't.
That was the version I had.
No,
They did. So, good.
So-
With this, let me now announce the scorecards for this evening. We are doing, as per the opposition MP and critique of the self-confessed critique of this government, we are doing poorly on China, we are doing fairly on the US, we are doing well on Israel, and we are doing well in the neighborhood, minus Pakistan. And I think that's pretty much the sum and substance of what we discussed with Shashi Tharoor this evening. Please join me in thanking him for being here and for sharing with us so freely.